The morning Stella Alden first pressed her palm flat against the rough-hewn timber of the old barn wall and felt the carved grooves beneath her fingers. She understood that the land she had come to claim already held secrets deeper than any grave she had left behind in Missouri. She had arrived in Broken Creek, Colorado Territory on the 14th of April, 1878, with two trunks, a mule named Percy, a small leather purse that held $37 and some loose change, and a grief so heavy it had settled into her bones like winter cold. Her husband, Robert Alden, had died of pneumonia the previous November, leaving her with a land deed, a stack of unpaid debts to a dry goods merchant in St. Louis, and the kind of silence that follows a man who was never particularly loud to begin with. She had mourned him properly. She had worn the black dress until it grew thin at the elbows. She had prayed over his grave and spoken kind words to the neighbors who came with casseroles and carefully chosen condolences. But when the snow melted and spring made its tentative appearance, Stella had looked at the cramped rented room above a candle-maker's shop in Jefferson City and known, with the quiet certainty that had always been her greatest and most inconvenient gift, that she could not stay. Robert had purchased the Colorado land on speculation 2 years before he died, part of a hopeful scheme he had never quite gotten around to explaining in full. He had called it their future. He had called it their chance. He had never called it anything practical, like a working homestead, because Robert Alden had been a dreamer in the most generous and most exhausting sense of the word. But the deed was real, witnessed and stamped, and when Stella's brother-in-law had offered to buy it from her for a sum so insultingly low that she suspected he thought her grief had softened her arithmetic, she had folded the deed into her bodice, smiled at him pleasantly, and begun packing. The journey west had taken 6 weeks by rail, stage, and finally by hired wagon driven by a taciturn man named Clem who spoke mostly to his horses and smelled permanently of pipe tobacco. Broken Creek itself was smaller than she had hoped and larger than she had feared. A settlement of perhaps 200 souls strung along a creek bed in a valley where the mountains rose behind it like cathedral walls. There was a general store run by a couple named Harker, a saloon called the Blue Sage that she could see from the main road without needing to enter, a church that appeared to be under perpetual construction, and a sheriff's office that also served as the post office and occasional dentist's chair, depending on the season. There were houses of varying ambition and permanence, a school that doubled as a meeting hall, and everywhere the smell of pine resin, horse, and the particular kind of hope that people carry west when every other direction has failed them. Clem had driven her out to the property in the late afternoon, when the light came sideways through the pines and turned everything gold and amber. The land itself was finer than she had expected. 40 acres with creek frontage, a south-facing slope good for a kitchen garden, and grass that was already growing thick and green with the spring runoff. There was a small cabin, solid enough, with a stone fireplace and a plank floor that someone had swept at some point in the last several years. And there was the barn. The barn was the finest thing on the property. It stood apart from the cabin by about 60 feet, built of straight-hewn timber with a proper peaked roof, double doors hung on iron hinges, and a hay loft that still held a modest winter store, gone dusty and dry now but unmistakably tended at some point. Stella had walked through it slowly while Clem unloaded her trunks, running her hand along the interior walls, feeling the careful dovetail joints where the corner timbers met, admiring the way the builder had used every inch of the space thoughtfully, placing the stalls where the afternoon sun would come through the gaps in the planks and warm the animals through the coldest months. It was in the back corner, low down near the foundation, where the light was poorest and the shadows gathered thick, that her fingers found the carving. She crouched down, pressing her palm flat, and felt the deliberate geometry of letters cut into the wood. She could not read them in the dimness, so she went back to her trunk and found a short tallow candle, lit it with a match from the tin she kept in her coat pocket, and returned. MB 1875. 2 letters and a year, cut deep and clean with what must have been a good sharp knife. The kind of mark a craftsman makes not out of vanity, but out of a quiet insistence on being known. Stella sat back on her heels and looked at those initials for a long time. The barn was 3 years old. She had arrived in the spring of 1878. Someone had built this barn before she ever set foot on this land, and whoever that person was, they had left their name here like a signature at the bottom of a letter. In the corner most people would never think to look. She set the candle down on the dirt floor and sat in the yellow light and felt, for the first time since Robert died, something other than grief. It was not happiness exactly. It was more like curiosity, which is sometimes the first cousin of hope when hope is still too frightened to come in from the cold. She asked about the initials the very next morning, when she walked into the Harker General Store to introduce herself and purchase flour, salt pork, dried beans, and a tin of coffee. The store was warm and smelled of sawdust and molasses, and Eleanor Harker, a woman of about 50 with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested she had heard every possible variety of human story and found most of them mildly amusing, listened with her head tilted to one side. MB, Eleanor repeated, testing the letters. Martin Boone. You know him? Stella asked. Everybody in Broken Creek knows Martin Boone, or at least knows of him, Eleanor said, wrapping a paper parcel of flour with practiced efficiency. He built half the sound structures in this valley. The man has a gift with timber, I will say that much. He built our store addition 3 years back and it has not shifted a single inch since. Does he live nearby? Eleanor set the parcel on the counter and gave Stella a look that carried more information than her words would. He lives about 4 miles east of your property, up against the ridge. Runs a small operation, some cattle, some timber contracting. Keeps to himself mostly. A pause, deliberate and weighted. He is a good man, Mrs. Alden, private but good. Stella noticed the particular emphasis Eleanor placed on the word private, and the way the shopkeeper's eyes carried something cautious in them, some held-back piece of knowing. She did not press. She had arrived 12 hours ago, and there was too much she did not yet understand about this place and its people to go pushing at doors before she had even learned which rooms they led to. She went home and planted a kitchen garden and introduced herself to Percy's new home and fixed the loose hinge on the cabin door and spent 4 days becoming acquainted with the rhythms of her land. The creek ran cold and clear. A pair of magpies had claimed the big pine near the cabin and regarded her with the imperial disdain that magpies reserve for newcomers. She found, in the root cellar beneath a flat stone, a glass jar containing 3 silver coins and a folded note that had been placed there so long ago the paper had begun to spot with age. The note read simply, in a careful masculine hand, for whoever comes next. Good water in the creek, sweet spring onions on the south bank, and watch the north pasture fence after a hard rain. It sets to leaning. She read the note 3 times. The handwriting was economical and precise. She thought of the initials in the barn. She was beginning to construct a picture of a person she had never met, and the picture had a particular quality to it that she recognized, the same quality you find in a well-made thing, in a joint that fits perfectly, in a sentence that says exactly what it means without ornamentation. The first time she actually saw Martin Boone was on a Thursday, 5 days after her arrival. She had gone down to the creek to wash some clothes and was spreading them over the willow branches to dry when she heard a horse on the road that ran along the property's eastern boundary. She straightened and looked, shading her eyes against the morning sun. He was riding a red roan mare with a white blaze, a tall man somewhere in the neighborhood of 32 or 33, wide through the shoulders in the way that comes from years of physical work rather than accident of birth. He wore a practical brown coat and a hat that had clearly been good once and was now just honest. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face that was weathered in the way that land and light and wind make a man's face when he spends most of his life outdoors. Even from 40 feet away, she could see that he had a quality of stillness about him, not the stillness of someone who has nothing to say, but the stillness of someone who has learned that most things do not require an immediate response. He saw her at almost the same moment she saw him, and he pulled the roan up short. They looked at each other across the distance with the particular wariness of two people who have heard of each other but not yet decided what to do about it. He touched the brim of his hat. She nodded, still shading her eyes. He nudged the mare and rode on, and that was the whole of their first meeting. She thought about it longer than was strictly warranted. The second time was a week later. She had been fighting with the north pasture fence, which had indeed set to leaning after a hard spring rain exactly as the note had warned, and she was red-faced and frustrated, and had acquired a splinter in the heel of her hand that was making her furious in the specific, intimate way that small injuries do when you are already tired. She heard hoofbeats and looked up, and there he was again, this time coming from the direction of the road, and this time he stopped at the fence line and dismounted without being asked. "Fence give you trouble," he said. His voice was deeper than she had expected, not loud, not trying for anything, just even and straightforward the way his handwriting had been. "The rain took out the post on the far end," she said, because she was not a woman who pretended difficulty was ease. "I have been trying to set it back in, but the ground is still too soft and I cannot get the leverage." He tied the mare to a standing post and came through the gate she had left open, and without further conversation he crouched by the leaning post, assessed it with his eyes and then with his hands, and began to work. She handed him the tools she had been using, and he used them differently, more efficiently, with the automatic authority of someone who has done this same task in every variation that weather and soil can produce. In 20 minutes the post was reset and packed tight with small stones from the creek bed that he went and gathered himself, and the fence line was true again. He stood and knocked the mud from his knees, and she handed him the cloth she had been using to wipe her face. "Thank you," she said. "I would have gotten there given enough time." "I know it," he said, without any condescension in it, simply acknowledging what was plainly true about her. She decided she liked him then, the way you decide a thing quietly and without fanfare, just a small door opening somewhere inside you. "You are Martin Boone," she said. Something moved in his face, a small surprise, though he contained it quickly. "Yes, ma'am." "You built my barn," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the barn from where they stood. "I built it 3 years ago," he said. "At the time, the previous owner had plans to run cattle. He sold the land not long after, and I heard it had changed hands again. I did not know anyone had come to settle it." "I found your initials," she said. "In the corner low down. I had to use a candle." He turned and looked at her then, a direct look, the kind that takes a moment's courage to sustain on the receiving end. "Most people would not look there," he said. "I look everywhere," she said. "I find it keeps me informed." He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, more like the idea of one, a suggestion, but she caught it and she stored it away. "Martin Boone," she said again, as if settling the name into place. "I am Stella Alden." "I know it," he said again, and she had the feeling that a leaner Harker had been communicating information in multiple directions. He collected his mare and rode off, and Stella stood in the field with the fixed fence post and the warm April sun on her face, and thought that she had now met two things in Broken Creek that were genuinely well-made: a barn and the man who built it. The weeks that followed were the business of establishing herself, which in the Colorado Territory in the spring of 1878 meant unrelenting physical work. She planted her kitchen garden and fought the deer that considered it their property. She mucked out the barn and discovered that the stall floors were built at a slight drainage angle, another piece of thoughtful carpentry that made the work easier and kept the animals healthier. She introduced Percy to the pasture and watched the old mule test the fence with his nose before deciding it was acceptable. She negotiated with Dale Harker about a line of credit for seed and got a better deal than he had expected her to, which she suspected surprised him and pleased a leaner. She attended the community church service one Sunday and met enough people to understand the general topology of Broken Creek's social landscape: who mattered, who caused trouble, who could be trusted, and who was simply loud. The rancher who caused the most general disruption in the valley was a man named Claude Ferris, who ran about 600 head on the biggest spread north of town, and had a way of expressing his opinions about water rights, grazing boundaries, and the general incompetence of smaller landholders that made smaller landholders want to hit him with something agricultural. He had blue eyes the color of glacier ice, and a mouth that smiled constantly, without ever involving the rest of his face. He came to call on Stella in her third week, riding up in his best clothes with his hat held politely in his hand, and he explained to her in very friendly terms that the creek boundary on her eastern pasture was a matter of some dispute, and that he would be willing to resolve it very generously if she were of a mind to be reasonable. Stella had served him coffee and listened to all of it without interrupting, and then she had gone and gotten her land deed, which she had memorized, and she had pointed out to him, pleasantly and specifically, exactly which survey markers defined her creek frontage, and exactly how they related to the creek's current course, and she had named the territorial land agent in Denver who had filed the deed, and who she had already written to with an introductory letter. Claude Ferris had drunk the rest of his coffee with a smile that had become slightly more effortful, and he had left without the concession he had come for. She mentioned the visit to Alina Harker the next day, not dramatically, just as information. Alina's expression went careful. "You should know he has made similar visits to 3 other small holders in this valley in the last 2 years," she said. "2 of them sold." "And the third?" Stella asked. "Martin Boone," Alina said. "He did not sell." Stella looked out through the store window at the mountain ridge to the east and felt the clean, bright feeling of understanding something in a new way. The next time she saw Martin Boone was at the spring gathering that the Broken Creek community held every May to mark the end of the worst of the mud season. It was held in the meadow behind the church, with tables set up for food and a fiddle player and a caller for the dancing. Stella went in her best dress, which was a dark green wool with white collar and cuffs, not festive exactly, but honest. She was not yet out of mourning in the official sense, but she had decided that Robert, who had always believed in people participating in life rather than watching it from the doorway, would have wanted her to go. Martin Boone was standing at the edge of the gathering with a cup of cider in his hand, talking to the blacksmith, a big quiet man named Tom Purdy. He saw Stella arrive and he nodded, and she nodded back, and they circled the gathering in the way of 2 careful people who are aware of each other's location at all times without making it obvious. She was talking to a young woman named Clara Voss, who had come to Broken Creek as a mail-order bride the previous year, and was still in the process of deciding whether she had made the right decision, when Martin appeared at her elbow. He excused the interruption politely and asked Clara, not Stella, if either of them might like some cider, which was a nicely done maneuver because it included them both in the offer without making any assumptions. Clara took the cider and was shortly drawn away by her husband, and Stella and Martin were left standing slightly apart from the main crowd. "The fence has held," she said. "Good ground under it now," he said. "Should not give you trouble again this season." "You knew about the leaning," she said. "You wrote the note." He was quiet for a moment. "I was not sure if anyone would find it," he said. "I found it," she said. "I find things." He looked at her sideways, and this time the near smile came all the way to the surface and became an actual one, brief and genuine and a little surprised at itself. It changed his face completely, opened something in it, and she understood in that moment why Alina Harker had chosen the word good with such deliberate emphasis. "The barn," she said, moving toward what she actually wanted to know. "You built it and then you left it. Why did you not stay and work the land yourself?" He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had trespassed somewhere she should not have. Then he said, "The land was not mine to settle. I was hired to build the barn by the first man who bought the deed. He was a friend of my father's. When he decided not to come west after all, I just kept an eye on the property, fixed what needed fixing, watched over it. For 3 years, she said. For 3 years, he agreed. That is a long time to tend something that belongs to someone else, she said. Things do not stop needing tending just because ownership is unclear, he said. She thought about that for quite a while. Around them, the fiddle started up and the caller began pulling people into a Virginia reel, and the evening became warm with movement and laughter, and Stella Alden stood in the lamplight beside Martin Boone and felt something shift in her, like a river changing course after a season of rain. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just the deep, quiet inevitability of water finding its true path. They talked for the rest of the evening, not the polite, surface-skimming conversation of new acquaintances, but the kind of real conversation that emerges when two people discover that the other person is interested in the same quality of truth. She told him about Missouri and Robert and the decision to come west. She did not dress it up or make it easier to hear. He listened with his full attention, which was a rare thing in her experience, and he did not offer condolences that were really just impatience for the difficult part to be over. He told her about growing up in Kentucky, learning carpentry from his grandfather, coming west in 1872 with 2 other men from his county, one of whom had died of a fever outside of Pueblo, and one of whom had married a ranch woman and settled near Cheyenne. He had come to Broken Creek and found the valley and known, in the same way Stella had described knowing things, that this was where he was supposed to be. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Coming here?" "No," he said, with a simple directness that left no room for qualification. "Not once." When the evening ended and people began to make their ways home through the spring dark, Martin walked Stella to where Percy was tied at the hitching post. He held the mule's halter while she mounted, and then he stepped back and looked up at her. "The roof of your woodshed is going to need attention before next winter," he said. "I noticed it riding past." "I had noticed it too," she said. "I have been trying to determine the best approach." "I could come and look at it," he said, "if you wanted." "I would like that," she said. He came the following Saturday and he looked at the woodshed roof, and they discussed the best approach, and then they discussed other things, and he stayed for supper, which was salt pork and beans and cornbread made in her cast-iron skillet, and they talked until the fire burned low and the stars came out thick over the mountains, and then he rode home in the dark because he was a man who knew the difference between a good evening and an imposition. He came back the next Saturday, and the one after that. It became the shape of their weeks, these Saturday visits, which began with some practical task and became conversation and became, in the gradual and lovely way of things that grow rather than being constructed, something they both looked forward to in a way they had not yet found the right words for. He repaired the woodshed roof over 2 Saturdays and would not take payment, which made her argue with him, which he clearly enjoyed despite not changing his position. She made him meals that grew more elaborate as she found her footing in the kitchen of her new home, and she could tell when a meal pleased him because a small muscle in his jaw relaxed, a tell he was probably unaware of. He was helping her build a proper chicken coop the 3rd Saturday when Claude Ferris rode through on the road and slowed his horse to watch them work with an expression that was impossible to read at a distance but impossible to mistake for friendliness. "He is watching," she said quietly. "He watches a lot of things," Martin said, driving a nail with 2 clean strokes. "He has been trying to consolidate this valley for 4 years. He does not like that some of us are still here." "What does he do about the ones who stay?" she asked. Martin paused and looked at her with a directness that told her he was deciding how much to say. "He makes it uncomfortable," he said finally. "He has ways of complicating access to the creek, of disputing water rights in ways that take months to resolve and cost money people do not have. He drives off hired help. He had a man's hay barn burned last summer, though nothing was ever proven." The air between them went still. "Whose barn?" she asked. "Tom Purdy's, the blacksmith. Tom rebuilt it himself." Martin set another nail. "Ferris does not do the dirty work himself." He has 2 men that ride for him who are not the sort of cowboys who are interested in actual cattle work. Stella was quiet for a moment, measuring the information. He has not approached me a second time, she said. He will, Martin said. He is patient in the way of people who are used to getting what they want eventually. He paused. He may also be under some impression that your situation here is more complicated than it is, given that you are a widow alone and that the land is small. My situation is not complicated, she said. It is entirely clear. I know it, he said, and the slight emphasis he put on the words made her look at him. He was looking at her with the same quality of directness he always had, but there was something added to it now, something that had not been there in the early weeks, or that had been there and covered over with careful restraint. She held the look for a breath longer than was merely conversational, and then she handed him the next nail and the moment passed, but it did not disappear. In June, Claude Ferris made his second approach, and this time it was not social. He had managed to get a surveyor from Denver, a man whose credentials seemed legitimate but whose conclusions were conveniently aligned with Ferris's existing opinions, to produce a document suggesting that the eastern boundary of Stella's property ran 40 feet west of where her deed placed it, which would have given Ferris not only a piece of her pasture but her creek access. She received the notice on a Wednesday, and by Thursday she was on her way to the land agent in Pueblo, which was the nearest office that could address the dispute officially. She had written to Martin the night before, not asking him to solve it, but telling him what was happening, because it had become natural to tell him things. The land agent in Pueblo took 2 days to locate the original survey records, and when they were produced, Stella's deed was supported entirely. She came home on Saturday with a certified copy of the original survey in her saddlebag, because she had borrowed a saddle horse from Tom Purdy and ridden the 60 miles, rather than waiting for the stage. She was mud-splashed and tired and deeply satisfied when she arrived home to find Martin at her place, having come for their usual Saturday, not knowing she had been gone. He was in the barn with Percy, who had developed a slight lameness and whom Martin had noticed, and was examining with the unhurried attention he gave to everything that needed care. He looked up when she came in, and his face went through several expressions in quick succession: the surprise of seeing her, something that looked very much like relief, and then a careful settling back into its usual stillness. "Percy all right?" she asked. "Stone bruise," he said. "He will be fine with a few days' rest. I put some poultice on it." "Thank you," she said. She was leaning against the barn door because the riding had been hard and her back ached. "I have been to Pueblo." He came out of the stall and stood in the center aisle and looked at her. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she produced the certified copy of the survey from her saddlebag, he took it and read it carefully, and she watched something that had been tight in him release. "You rode 60 miles alone," he said. "There and back," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You did not have to do it alone," he said. "I know it," she said, using his own words back at him gently. He looked away, and she could see him working through something behind the stillness of his face, something that wanted to come forward and was not quite sure of its welcome. "Martin," she said. "Stella," he said at the same moment. They both stopped. She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed, truly laughed, in so long that the sound surprised her and clearly surprised him. He looked at her with the kind of helpless expression a man gets when a woman's laugh catches him completely off guard and he has no defenses prepared. "You first," she said. "I was going to say," he started and then stopped and started again. "I have been glad you came here, to this valley, to this property." He stopped again. The man who was never at a loss in the physical world was plainly at a considerable loss in this one. "I find that I think about you a great deal, about how you are getting on, about what you might need." He looked at her directly then, committing. "About whether you might be of a similar mind." The barn smelled of hay and horse and the pine poultice he had mixed for Percy, and the evening light was coming through the planks in long golden bars, and Stella Alden, who had ridden 60 miles on a borrowed horse to defend her home and come back filthy and triumphant, looked at the man who had built her barn before she ever arrived and felt the last of the grief cold leave her bones entirely. "A similar mind," she said. "Yes, I think that is a fair description of where I am." He crossed the distance between them in a few steps, and he took her hand, the one with the old splinter scar on the heel, and he held it with both of his. And they stood in the barn he had built, and the evening light held them there, and it was enough, more than enough. It was the beginning of something that felt like solid ground. They were careful about it after that, in the way of two people who have both been bruised by loss and time, and understand that what is real does not need to be hurried. He came on Saturdays and sometimes Wednesdays. She began to look for reasons to ride past his place on the East Ridge, and he began to find reasons to be visible when she did. They talked about everything: the land, the cattle prices, the state of the road after the June rains, the books they had both managed to keep through all their moving, the particular quality of the light in the valley at different times of day. And in between the talking, they began to find their way toward each other through 100 small, deliberate gestures. The way he always noticed what she needed before she asked, the way she always had coffee ready when she heard his horse on the road, the way they had established, without discussing it, a rhythm of companionship so natural it felt less like a new thing and more like a thing remembered. Eleanor Harker noticed and said nothing, which was its own form of approval. Tom Purdy noticed and grinned at Martin in the way of a man who has been waiting for his friend to come to his senses. Clara Voss noticed and was openly delighted in the generous way of someone who is glad to see others navigate a thing she is still navigating herself. And Claude Ferris noticed, and his expression when he saw them together in town one July afternoon was the one specific expression that Stella had been watching for. The recognition that she was not isolated, that she had roots and allies and a man who stood beside her with the unhurried certainty of someone who has surveyed the ground and decided exactly where he intends to plant his feet. July was beautiful in the valley in a way that made Stella understand completely why Martin had chosen to stay. The wildflowers came up in drifts of blue and yellow along the creek banks, and the mountains held their snow late into the summer and were genuinely tremendous, the kind of scale that makes a person feel both small and expanded at the same time, as if the enormousness of the world is not a threat but an invitation. Her kitchen garden was producing more than she had hoped. Her chickens had settled and were laying well. Percy's lameness had resolved, and he was fat and contentedly disagreeable. One afternoon in late July, Martin brought her a calf. He arrived with it tied loosely behind his horse, a red and white Hereford calf about 3 months old, and he explained with elaborate casualness that he had a surplus this season and that she had mentioned wanting to build toward a small herd, and this seemed like a practical arrangement. She looked at the calf, who regarded her with the mild, unimpressed expression of a young bovine encountering a new human. "A gift," she said. "An investment," he said, "in the valley's cattle economy." "Martin Boone," she said. "Stella Alden," he said. She named the calf Robert because Robert Alden had believed in good land and new beginnings, and the calf seemed to embody both. Martin was there when she named it, and he received the information with the same careful attention he gave to everything she said, and he nodded, because he understood that the past is not a rival to the present but its foundation. In August, things with Claude Ferris came to a head. Two of his riders, the ones Martin had described with the particular neutrality of a man describing a known danger, came onto Stella's property on a Tuesday morning when she was alone. They did not pretend a friendly purpose. They rode through her south pasture gate, which she had left open while she worked on the fence, and they stopped their horses 50 feet from where she was working, and they told her, in the way of men who speak for someone with money behind them, that their employer had revised his offer for the property downward considerably, given the trouble she had brought to the survey dispute, and that this was a final offer and she would be wise to consider it seriously. Stella was holding a fence stretcher and a pair of pliers. She set them down deliberately and turned to face the riders, and she told them, in terms that were clear and absolutely final, that the property was not for sale, that any further attempts to influence her on the matter would be documented and reported to the sheriff in Broken Creek, and that they were now trespassing, and she would give them 30 seconds to leave before she went and got her rifle. She did not raise her voice once. The riders exchanged a look and left at a pace that was faster than they had arrived, and Stella picked up her fence stretcher and went back to work, and her hands did not shake until she was inside the cabin that evening with the door latched. She did not tell Martin immediately, because she was not sure how to describe it without it sounding like she needed rescuing, which she did not, and without it sounding like she was not shaken at all, which would have been a lie. She told him on Saturday, matter-of-factly, as part of the account of the week. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. The quietness had a texture to it that she had learned to read. This one was controlled anger, the kind that comes from caring about someone and being unable to stand between them and a danger that has already passed. "You handled it exactly right," he said finally. "You should know that." "I know it," she said. He looked at her, and the controlled anger softened into something more unguarded than she had seen in him before. "Stella," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "I want you to know that I am here," he said. "Whatever that means to you, whatever use it is, I am here." "It is of considerable use," she said. "It is of more use than you probably know." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And it was the finest kind of silence, the kind that is full rather than empty. Sheriff Roy Briggs, who was a compact man in his late 40s with the weathered patience of someone who has managed a frontier community long enough to have seen most possible varieties of human behavior, came to call on Stella the following week. He had received, through channels he declined to specify, a report of an intimidation incident on her property, and he wanted her account. She gave it to him in full and precise detail, including the names of the two riders, which she had recognized from prior sightings in town, and he wrote it down without comment, and told her that similar reports had been building for some time regarding Ferris's operations in the valley, and that things were coming to a point of formal reckoning. He would not commit to a timeline or a specific outcome, but his manner was that of a man who has made up his mind about a problem and is in the process of executing on it methodically. Weeks later, one of Ferris's riders, a man named Jeb Cotton, who had been the more vocal of the two who had visited Stella, was arrested in connection with the burning of Tom Purdy's hay barn the previous summer, based on testimony that Briggs had spent months quietly gathering. Cotton, facing serious charges, provided information about Ferris's broader conduct in the valley, including documented instances of intimidation, fraudulent survey claims, and deliberate destruction of property. Claude Ferris did not go to prison, because men of his means rarely did in 1878 in the Colorado Territory, but he was publicly and formally censured, required to settle several outstanding water rights disputes in favor of the smaller landholders, and stripped of the political goodwill he had cultivated with the county seat through the sudden inconvenience of having his methods made a matter of public record. He sold 400 acres the following spring and reduced his presence in the valley to something considerably less imperial. It was not perfect justice, but it was enough justice to change the shape of life in Broken Creek for the better, and that was what mattered. By the time the aspens turned in October, running gold up the mountain ridges in the way that makes even people who have seen it many times stop what they are doing and look, Stella had been in Broken Creek for 6 months, and it had become home in the way that a place becomes home, not through the passage of time alone, but through the accumulation of the specific, particular things that make a life. The familiar sound of the creek at different water levels, the exact angle of the morning light through the kitchen window, the path that Percy had worn between the barn and the water trough, the names of the magpies that she had begun, privately, to distinguish from one another. And Martin Boone, who came on Saturdays and Wednesdays and sometimes other days, who knew her fence lines as well as his own, and could read the weather coming off the peaks with the accuracy of long experience, and who had a way of listening that made her feel that everything she said was worth the air it displaced. They were riding the property boundary together one October afternoon, a thing they had fallen into as a comfortable shared habit, checking fences and noting what would need attention before winter, when Stella reined in her borrowed horse at the top of the south slope where you could see the whole valley laid out below, the creek silver in the afternoon light, the cabin small and solid among its trees, and the barn, her barn, his barn, standing at its proper distance, its straight timber lines and peaked roof unmistakable even from this height. "You can see it from here," she said. He drew up beside her and looked where she was looking. "Good sightlines from this ridge," he said. "I mean the barn," she said. "I can see the corner where your initials are from here if I know where to look." He looked at her sideways. "You cannot actually see them from here." "I know where they are," she said. "That is almost the same thing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When I carved those initials, I was alone here. I had been alone in this valley for 2 years. I built that barn and I put my mark on it because I wanted something to remain, something that said I had been here and done something worth doing. I did not know then who would come. I did not know there would be a you." Stella looked at him, and the October light was in his face, and the aspens were burning gold all around them, and she thought that of all the things that had happened since April, since the carving in the corner and the note under the stone and the Saturday visits and the fence line and the long evenings by the fire, this was the moment she would always return to when she thought about how it had all begun and how it had arrived at where it was now. "There is a you," she said quietly. "There has been for some time." He turned fully toward her on his horse, and his eyes were the particular dark that the autumn light brings out, and he said, with a straightforwardness that was entirely and completely him, "Stella, I would like to ask you to marry me. I know it is perhaps sooner than is conventional, and you are only 6 months out of mourning, and I will wait however long is right. But I want you to know that it is what I am asking." The valley was very quiet in the way that high places go quiet when the wind drops, and Stella Alden, who had buried one man and crossed 1,000 miles of country alone, and faced down hired riders in her pasture, and ridden 60 miles on a borrowed horse, and built a life on 40 acres with a kitchen garden and 1 mule, looked at Martin Boone, and felt the last of every door she had been keeping carefully closed swing open with the simple, irresistible ease of good hinges properly hung. "Yes," she said, "not in 6 months, now this winter before the hard cold comes, yes." He leaned across the space between their horses and took her face in his hands, and he kissed her in the October sun on the ridge above the valley, and the aspens shook in a gust of wind that felt, she would later say, as if the whole mountain had decided to applaud. They were married in November, in the Broken Creek church which had finally achieved a state of completion sufficient for the purpose, in a ceremony performed by the traveling minister who came through the valley every 6 weeks. Eleanor Harker cried in the determined, dabbing way of a woman who considers public emotion permissible on specific occasions. Tom Purdy was Martin's witness, which he accepted with the grin that seemed to be his primary mode of expression when Martin was involved. Clara Voss organized the gathering at the community hall afterward and produced a cake that was widely agreed to be the best thing anyone in Broken Creek had eaten in recent memory. Sheriff Briggs attended and shook Martin's hand with an expression of warm approval that carried, Stella thought, a small component of personal relief, as if the whole business of Stella Alden, her land rights and her fence lines and her uninvited visitors, had been resolved in the most satisfactory way he could have imagined. The evening after everyone had gone home and the community hall was dark and the cold had settled proper over the valley, Stella and Martin rode home together to the 40 acres, and Martin stayed, and it was home for both of them now, as straightforwardly and completely as that. The winter was hard, as Colorado winters are, with snow that came early and deep and stayed. But the barn held everything it needed to hold with absolute solidity, and the woodshed roof that Martin had repaired kept the wood dry through every storm, and the cabin fireplace drew well and heated the two rooms adequately. And Stella found that a hard winter is a very different proposition when you have someone to share the work of it, not because the work is less, but because the sharing of it changes its quality entirely. She found new things about him in the winter proximity that she had not had occasion to discover in the careful rhythms of their courtship. He woke before dawn every morning, not with difficulty, but as a matter of course, with the immediate full wakefulness of a man whose body has been trained to readiness. He made coffee before anything else, and the first cup he always brought to her, which she received as the daily gesture of love it was. He carved in the evenings by the fire, small precise things, a wooden spoon, a door latch, the handles of tools and sometimes decorative things, small animals with accurate details, which he would examine for a moment when finished, and then set aside as if they had satisfied a need but were not themselves the point. He was entirely without self-pity, which she respected greatly, and he was slow to speak and quick to notice, which she found, after a lifetime of people who were the opposite, deeply restful. He was also, she discovered, very funny, not in the way of men who perform their humor, but in the way of someone who has observed the world carefully and accurately and sometimes cannot resist noting the gap between how things are and how they present themselves. He made her laugh with a frequency and a genuine surprise that she would not have predicted from the still, careful man she had first seen on the road in April, and she thought sometimes that the laughter itself was the most intimate thing, more intimate even than the physical tenderness of marriage, because it required a confidence in each other's understanding that went beyond the body entirely. In February, in the deep of the winter, Martin came in from the barn one morning where he had been with the two cattle they were now running, because Robert the calf had been followed by a modest expansion, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with an expression that contained a careful, precious hopefulness. "There is something I have been thinking about," he said. "I know," she said. She had known for a week. He blinked. "You know." "I have suspected," she said, "for about 7 days. I was waiting to be sure before I said anything because you have a way of looking at me when you think I am not noticing, and it has changed in the last few weeks." He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with the helpless expression she had first seen the evening of the community gathering. "You are the most observant person I have ever met," he said. "I find it keeps me informed," she said. He crossed the kitchen and took her hands. "You are well?" he asked, with the specific quality of care he always used when the question mattered. "I am very well," she said. "I am better than I have been in a long time." He held her hands and looked at her, and she could see the full weight of his feeling in his face, undisguised and unguarded in the way he permitted himself to be only with her, and she thought of the initials in the corner of the barn, the quiet insistence on being known, and she thought that she had found the man who made those marks, and he was precisely the same man as the marks suggested, careful and committed and present and here. Spring came back to the valley in the way that spring always comes to high country, reluctantly and then all at once, the snow retreating up the mountain slopes and the creek running high and cold, and the meadows going green with a speed that seemed to answer the long months of white and gray. Stella's kitchen garden went in earlier this year, with Martin's help, and with a considerably more ambitious plan, because 2 people eating means more growing, and she had plans for preserving and putting up that would require a full root cellar by November. The magpies in the big pine had produced 3 young ones who regarded the world with the same imperial disdain as their parents, only louder. Percy had made his peace with the expanding cattle population, and had established a social hierarchy in the pasture that everyone, including the cattle, seemed to accept. The barn stood solid and weathered, and completely unmoved by any of the winter storms, which Stella noted with a satisfaction that was both practical and private. On a bright morning in early May, almost exactly a year since she had arrived, she went to the back corner of the barn and crouched low and put the flat of her hand against the carving she had found with a candle on her second day. MB 1875. She had her own good sharp knife with her, the one she used for splitting kindling, and she worked carefully and slowly for about 20 minutes. Then she stood and brushed the shavings from her skirt and went back to the cabin. Martin found it in the afternoon, when he went in to check on a cow who had been showing signs of calving. He was checking the stall when some quality of the changed light in the corner drew his eye, and he went and crouched the same way she had crouched, and he put his hand against the wood. SAB 1878. He stayed crouched for a long time, his hand on the letters. Then he sat down in the dirt of the barn floor, his back against the wall, and he put his face in his hands, and Stella, who had been watching from the barn door, went and sat down beside him in the dirt, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the quiet of the barn in the corner with both their names in it. After a while he said, "S.A.B., Stella Alden Boone," she said. "I thought it was time." He kissed her hair. "It was past time," he said. The summer of their first year of marriage was one that Stella would remember for the rest of her life, as a kind of gold standard against which other times were measured. The valley was productive, the cattle thrived, the garden was abundant, and there was the daily pleasure of a shared life with someone whose company you find genuinely preferable to solitude, which is not, she had come to understand, an insignificant or common thing. They worked hard and they worked together, which made the work different, not easy but purposeful in a way that solitary labor can never quite achieve. Evenings they sat on the cabin step and watched the light leave the mountains, and they talked or they did not, and both were good. She was carrying their child by July, which she told Martin on a Thursday evening with the matter-of-fact clarity she brought to important information, and he received it with the helpless, uncovered joy of a man who has wanted something so much, and so quietly that its arrival undoes him completely. He was, for about 30 seconds, entirely without his usual composure, and she found it one of the most endearing 30 seconds of her experience of him. He put his hand on her face and said with great seriousness, "You are well, you are well." "I am extraordinarily well," she said. He kissed her with a thoroughness that was its own answer to the question of how he felt about it. The child was born in February of 1880, in the cabin on a night when the snow was coming sideways off the ridge, and the wind was making the kind of sound in the pines that had no useful interpretation, except that it was February, and that was what February did. Eleanor Harker had come to be with her, having made it known months in advance that she would brook no argument on this point, and she was steady and warm and practical in all the ways that mattered, and Martin was in the next room maintaining a state of controlled tension that Stella, even in the labor of it, found touching and somewhat amusing. The child came at 2 in the morning and was a boy, solid and loud in the immediate and declarative way of the newly arrived, and Eleanor brought him out to Martin, who was standing by the fireplace in the way of a man who has been standing there for 4 hours and has worn a small patch in the floorboards, and Martin took his son with the awkward reverence of a first-time father and stood absolutely still and looked at the child's face. Stella called from the bedroom, "Is he all right?" "He is," Martin said, and his voice was entirely unlike its usual self, roughened by something more than cold air, magnificent. They named him James William Boone. James for Martin's grandfather, who had taught him to read wood grain and cut true. William for Stella's father, who had taught her to read people and trust her own knowing. The name settled on the boy like something that had always been waiting for him. James was, from the beginning, a child of considerable opinions and efficient communication of same, which Stella took as evidence of his having inherited the best of both his parents' qualities, and which Martin took as evidence that the world was about to receive an improved version of his own stubbornness, which was saying something. The cabin was small for 3 people and 1 large personality, but it was warm and full, and the winter had never felt less cold. The following spring, with James in a sling on Stella's back, they broke ground for the addition to the cabin that they had designed together on paper over the winter, 2 more rooms on the south side, with a proper kitchen window that would catch the afternoon light, and a sleeping room that would grow with the family. Martin did the framing and Stella did the finish work on the interior, which they had not planned this division of labor, but arrived at it naturally through the discovery that she had a gift for the interior detail, the careful fitting of boards, the smooth plastered walls that matched and complemented his structural accuracy in a way that made the final thing better than either could have produced alone. Tom Purdy came and helped raise the new roof timbers over a long Saturday, with 3 other men from the valley who had accumulated debts to Martin over the years and were glad of the opportunity to begin settling them. Leaner brought food enough for twice as many people, and there was cider and good weather and the particular satisfaction of a community doing something together that makes everything feel more possible. Claude Ferris had continued his reduced presence in the valley, and his 2 troublesome riders had both moved on, one to Cheyenne and one to wherever men like that go when their usefulness in a place has been fully extinguished. Ferris himself kept a grudging and formal peace. He nodded to Martin in town. He did not nod to Stella, but he also did not bother her, and that was sufficient. Sheriff Briggs retired in the fall of 1880, having achieved, as he told Martin at the farewell gathering in the community hall, a situation in the valley that was as close to orderly as a man could reasonably hope for, which he considered an acceptable life's work. The new sheriff was a younger man named Hale, who was competent and fair, and who regarded Martin with the respect that the valley generally accorded him, which had solidified over the years from the quiet regard for a good craftsman into something broader, the regard that communities develop for people who are simply and consistently reliable in all the ways that matter. In the spring of 1882, James turned 2 and began the independent mobility phase of childhood that rewarded every preparatory measure Martin had put into the fences, gates, and raised thresholds around the property. He was a sturdy, cheerful child who had his father's stillness at rest and his mother's observational intensity in motion, and who had developed a profound attachment to the barn, specifically to the corner where the initials were, where he would go and pat the wood with his small hand in imitation of the way he had seen both his parents do it. Stella was carrying their second child by summer, which she announced to Martin at the breakfast table one morning with the same straightforward clarity she used for all important information, and he received it with the same helpless, uncovered joy as the first time, which she had wondered about whether it would repeat, and it did completely. "You might settle to that information more efficiently with practice," she said. "I might not," he said, still holding her hand. She laughed and he laughed, and James, who was eating cornmeal mush with intense concentration, looked up at the laughter and laughed too, not knowing what was funny but finding the general atmosphere of it agreeable. The second child came in January of 1883, also a boy, which Martin received with a quiet delight that had in it nothing of disappointment, because he had long since privately concluded that whatever the world sent him he would find deeply sufficient. They named this one Henry Robert Boone, Henry for a family name of Stella's mother's people, and Robert for the man who had bought the land and dreamed of the West and never made it here, who deserved to be remembered in the life that his impractical vision had ultimately made possible. Henry was different from James in every possible way, softer where James was declarative, patient where James was urgent, inclined toward sitting and watching where James was inclined toward investigation and intervention. They were good brothers from the beginning, with the specific complementary affection of opposites who recognize in each other something they lack and consider it a gift rather than a competition. The farm grew steadily over the next years. A proper herd, better fences, a new chicken house that Stella designed herself and that Martin built to her specifications, which he did without modification, because her specifications were accurate and he knew how to recognize a well-considered plan. They planted a small orchard on the south slope, apple and pear, the trees young enough that they would not fruit for years, yet but planted with the confidence in the future that belongs to people who have built something worth staying for. In the spring of 1884, Martin took on a large timber contracting job from a new mill operation setting up in the county, the kind of job that would take the better part of a year and require him to be away from the farm for weeks at a time, working the ridge timber with 2 hired men. It was the first significant separation of their marriage, and they prepared for it with the practical seriousness they brought to things that required preparation. Before he left for the first long stretch, Martin went to the barn in the early morning. Stella came out and found him in the back corner, crouched with his knife. He was carving something beside their initials. She waited in the barn door. When he stood and came out, his face had the particular private quality of a man who has done something that satisfies him at a level that does not require explanation. She went and looked. Below MB 1875 and SAB 1878, he had added JWB 1880 and HRB 1883. Small, clean, precisely cut in the same hand. She stood and looked at all 4 sets of initials for a long time. The Boones. All of them present in this corner, in the wood that had been here before any of them, that had sheltered and held and stood through 3 years of changing ownership and 6 more years of this particular family, and would stand for decades beyond all of them. "It is a good barn," she said. Martin came and stood beside her. "It is a good life," he said. She took his hand. "It is the best life," she said, with the quiet certainty that had always been her greatest gift and that had never, in all the years since April of 1878, misled her. He was away for 6 weeks the first time and 4 the second and 3 the third, and each return was its own homecoming with James and Henry at the fence by the road half a day before he arrived, because they had inherited their mother's capacity for knowing things before they happened, and Stella at the door with coffee because it was what she always had, and the farm and the creek and the mountains settling back into their proper proportion when all 5 of them were in it together. The timber contract concluded successfully in the early spring of 1885, and the payment from it allowed them to do the one thing they had been putting off, a proper well dug close to the cabin, so Stella no longer had to carry water from the creek in all weathers. Martin hired a well driller from Pueblo and supervised the work with the attention he gave to everything done on the property, and when clean water came up at 38 feet, Stella declared it the finest thing that had happened to the farm since she first arrived, which Martin contested on the grounds that several things had happened since her arrival that he considered equally significant. She allowed that this was a reasonable point. In the summer of 1885, Clara Voss, who had resolved her earlier uncertainty about whether she had made the right decision by the practical method of making it the right decision through 7 years of deliberate effort, came to Stella one afternoon with news that her husband's young cousin had come west and was looking for work and a fresh start, and was there anything at the Boone farm that might need an extra pair of hands through the harvest season. Stella said yes, and the young man, whose name was David and who was 22 and earnest and willing, came and worked the harvest and did well enough that Martin offered him a standing arrangement, and by the following spring, David had built himself a small cabin on the north corner of the property and become a genuine member of the operation. James, by this time, was 6 and following his father everywhere that was permitted and several places that were not, absorbing the farm's workings with the focused attention of a child who has decided what he intends to become. Henry, at 3, had become deeply attached to Percy, who had developed a tolerance for the child that he extended to no other living creature, and the 2 of them could often be found in the barn together in a state of mutual comfortable silence that seemed to satisfy them both. In the autumn of that year, Stella found out she was carrying their 3rd child. She told Martin in the same morning manner as always, and he received it in the same helpless, whole-bodied joy, and she said, "You are not going to learn to take this information with any greater composure, are you?" "I am not," he said firmly. "I consider the absence of composure to be an appropriate response." "It is consistent," she agreed. The third child came in the spring of 1886, a girl this time, which James announced to the valley with the enthusiastic authority of a 7-year-old, who considers himself the primary expert on family developments. They named her Constance Boone, for the month of her expected arrival, which she honored by coming exactly on schedule, and Constance for the quality that Stella had always considered the most undervalued virtue, and that the people she most admired all possessed without calling attention to it. Was bright-eyed from her first morning, and regarded her brothers with the sovereign calm of someone who has arrived into a situation and immediately understood that she is going to manage it. Henry adored her absolutely. James treated her with the careful, slightly worried attention of someone who has encountered something he cannot yet classify and is not sure whether it is an ally or a complication. He would, within 2 years, conclude definitively that she was an ally of the first order. The barn corner accumulated 2 more sets of initials, MCB 1886 for me. The carving was Martin's work, done with the same precise hand, and when Stella saw it she traced each letter with her finger, and Martin watched her do it, and they stood in the back corner of the barn that had been there before all of them, in the low light, with the sounds of the farm around them, and it was a full and ordinary and extraordinary moment of the kind that makes up a life, the kind that does not announce itself as memorable but proves to be so. By 1888, Broken Creek had grown into something that could genuinely be called a proper settlement. The church was fully complete, the school had a permanent teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Porter who was formidably educated and only briefly intimidated by the country. There was a doctor's office, which was also the doctor's home, the doctor being a man of 40 named Whitfield who had come west for reasons he kept private and who was competent and available in all weathers. The Blue Sage Saloon had acquired a piano and a rival establishment 2 doors down, which was considered a sign of commercial vitality. The road through town had been properly graded. Letters and packages arrived on a reliable schedule. Martin Boone had become, in the decade since his first meeting with Stella on the Spring Road, one of the genuinely respected figures in the valley, the kind of man a community accretes its trust around the way, a creek accretes stone, slowly and without announcement until one day you look, and there is something solid there that has changed the shape of the ground around it. He had built or repaired more structures in the valley than anyone had kept formal count of. He had served on the Land Dispute Committee that was established after the Ferris affair. He had helped 3 different struggling families with labor during their hardest seasons without making a record of it that would embarrass anyone. He was exactly what he had seemed in the back of Alina Harker's description, a good man, private, but good. Stella had her own standing in Broken Creek that had nothing to do with being anyone's wife. She had served on the school board for 3 years and had been the primary advocate for Miss Porter's hiring, when some members of the board had suggested that a woman teacher might not command sufficient authority. She had been proven comprehensively right, as Miss Porter's students consistently outperformed those from comparable schools in the county assessments. A fact Stella mentioned at the board meeting with a quiet precision that she had developed over years of being right and choosing the right moment to say so. She had organized the valley's first communal preserving operation, where a dozen farm women pooled labor and resources through the harvest weeks and produced enough put-up food that 3 families who had poor harvests that year were supplied through the winter without anyone having to frame it as charity, which would have made the receiving of it impossible for the people who needed it most. Alina Harker, whose observational gifts had not diminished with age, said to Dale one evening that Stella Boone was the best thing that had happened to this valley in the decade she had been in it. And Dale, who was a man of few words but good ones, said he reckoned Martin felt similarly. And Alina said she knew it, and wasn't it wonderful, and they left it there. One evening in the September of 1888, a decade after Stella had arrived, she and Martin were sitting on the cabin step in the cooling air. James was inside helping Henry with his letters, a tutorial that apparently required significant negotiation based on the voices audible through the window. Me was asleep. David had gone to his cabin. Percy was making his considered way to the water trough. The mountains were going purple and rose in the last of the light. Martin said, without preamble, in the way he had of saying important things as if they were ordinary observations, "I have been thinking about the barn." "What about it?" she said. "It is 12 years old now," he said. "The timber is still sound, but the roof needs new cedar shingles on the north side, and I am thinking the main door hinges should be replaced before winter." "All right," she said. "I am also thinking," he said, and there was a different quality in it now, the careful private quality, "that it is the finest thing I ever built. Not because of the carpentry, because of what came after." She looked at him in the last light. This man she had found through 2 letters cut in a corner. This man who wrote notes about spring onions and fence posts for people he would never meet. This man who had built her a barn before he knew she existed, and then rebuilt her life alongside his, thoroughly and carefully and without a single wasted motion. "Martin," she said. "Stella," he said. "It is the finest thing I ever found," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the October darkness was coming down gentle off the mountains, and the creek ran its consistent faithful sound, and in the barn that bore all their names in the corner, the cattle were settled and Percy was at his trough, and the cedar smell of good timber was holding the history of all of them, and the valley was still and full and entirely home. The years continued to accumulate with the comfortable richness of a life that has found its right shape. James grew into exactly the young man his early character had suggested he would be, deliberate and capable, with his father's gift for physical work, and his mother's gift for reading a situation accurately. He had Martin's stillness and Stella's observational intensity in full combination now that he was older, which made him both easy to trust and occasionally unnerving to be around when he chose to comment on something he had noticed, because he was almost never wrong. Henry grew tall and remained the soft and patient creature he had always been, with a gift for animals that went beyond Percy and extended to every creature on the farm and several belonging to the neighbors, who had learned to bring their difficult animals to Henry when they could not determine what was wrong. Me grew into a force of nature with her mother's precision, and Martin maintained absolutely no one else's stubbornness whatsoever, which Stella contested with the smile she reserved for arguments she was going to win. David had become family in the way that some people who are not blood become family, through time and shared work, and the particular trust that grows between people who have seen each other at their worst and best weather, and chosen to stay anyway. He had, in 1887, begun a correspondence with a young woman in Pueblo who had a cousin in Broken Creek, a correspondence that was proceeding toward a conclusion that everyone on the farm was doing their best not to comment on because commentary would only slow things down. In the autumn of 1890, Martin went to the back corner of the barn with his knife one more time. Stella came in and found him there, as she always seemed to, and waited. He stood and she looked. Below all the other initials in the same clean, careful hand, he had carved DA 1887 for David, the year he had first come to work for them, and below that, because Martin Boone was a man who planned ahead and made space, he had left 2 clear blank sections of wood ready. "For whoever comes next," Stella said softly, echoing the note from the root cellar from a lifetime ago. "For whoever comes next," Martin agreed. She took his hand, and they stood together in the barn that had started all of it, with all their names around them like a record of a life lived in full. And the light came through the planks in the late afternoon way it always had and always would, and the valley outside was going gold with the season, And inside this barn that had been built before she arrived, that had held her first question and his first answer in every year since, Stella Alden Boone knew. With the quiet certainty that had always been her greatest gift, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The following spring, David's correspondence concluded in the way everyone had been quietly hoping for, and he brought his wife, a capable and warm woman named Ruth, to Broken Creek, and she was absorbed into the farm and the valley and the community with the ease of someone who has found the place they were looking for. By winter, there was the clear possibility of another set of initials needed for the barn wall in due course, and Martin measured the remaining space with the eye of a man who builds things to last, and found there was room enough, room for a generation more at least. James, at 17, had begun to take on real responsibility in the farm's operation, the kind that was no longer assistance but genuine partnership, and he did it with a seriousness that made both his parents simultaneously proud and briefly wistful for the 7-year-old who had needed to be lifted over the fence. Henry, at 14, was considering whether the valley's doctor needed an apprentice, and was conducting this consideration with the patient thoroughness that was his characteristic mode. Me, at 11, had opinions about everything, and expressed them with a precision that made Miss Porter note in her annual report that among her students one in particular showed exceptional analytical capacity, which everyone in the valley took as the politely constrained version of something considerably more emphatic. On a morning in the spring of 1891, Stella went alone to the barn before anyone else was awake, in the early gray light when the birds were just beginning and the valley was still holding its breath before the day. She went to the back corner and she crouched and put her palm flat against the wood, covering all the names together. The timber was warm under her hand with the stored warmth of the night, and she could feel the carved letters through her skin, her own and Martin's and their children's and David's, this record of a family cut into a wall by hands that had earned their marks. She heard the barn door behind her and did not need to turn to know who it was. Martin came and crouched beside her and put his hand over hers, and they held all the names together in the early light. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Outside, the creek ran its clear, unwavering sound, and the mountains were going pink with the first sun, and the magpies in the big pine began their loud and imperial commentary on the day. And somewhere in the cabin James was already up, and Henry was probably still deeply asleep, and me was very likely already planning something that would require adult attention, and the whole of it. The names and the barn and the farm and the family and the valley and this man beside her with his hand over hers on all their names was so completely and exactly right that she could find no word for it that was large enough. So she said nothing, and he said nothing, and they stayed in the corner of the barn he had built before she arrived, in the early light of another spring, and it was everything,